Hello and welcome to the Debating Toastcast, a podcast about all things debating, from the Debate Toastmasters Club, 104 London Debaters.
Hello, I'm William and I am your host here at this episode of the Debating Toastcast. And this time we are going to talk about a fallacy called the straw man. And I've entitled this podcast episode Burning the Straw Man, not because it's some sort of tweaked remake of the classic British horror film, The Wicker Man, which I hope you have watched, and if you haven't, put it on your list. One of those one ought to have seen at least once in a lifetime. Instead, the straw man is actually a rather pernicious and sneaky fallacy that reduces the quality of debates, not only debates, also of any discussion, conversation where you are talking about two different points of views and discussing the merits of these. So I suggest we get our intellectual matchbox out and let's start to burn down this destroyer of meaningful exchanges. Now, in principle, the straw man is an easy fallacy to understand. It is quite simply when debater B argues against something debater A did not actually say. Now, hang on, you might say, who would want to do such a stupid thing? The answer is you and me. Yes, because at some point, we have all committed this fallacy, mostly though, without knowing, actually. Sometimes with knowing. That depends a bit on the context and your profession. If you're a politician, for example, chances are you've done it very knowingly. But for most of us, we often do it without really being aware of it. So let me give you an example from a current topic of debate here in the United Kingdom, where I'm sitting. Let's say, for example, debater A gives the following argument. I think we ought to have better control with our borders and with immigration, and perhaps reduce overall numbers coming in to make sure we can integrate people properly who do come. And then on comes debater B. That's a terrible idea. Immigrants have contributed so much to this country. Let me give you 15 examples of positive contribution by immigrants. Number one, etc., 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 etc. Now, notice, debater B did not engage with any of the points debater A put forward, but instead argued that as if debater A had said, immigrants do not make any positive contributions, or we should close our borders completely and have no more immigration at all. But of course, that is not what debater A said. Now, it also works the other way, so let's turn the argument the other way around. So debater A, I think we ought to have a more generous immigration policy and system. Perhaps let a few more people come in, actually, and ensure that there is a legal and safe route for those genuine refugees who wish to come to this country, as that will undermine the business case for the illegal people smugglers. Debater B. That's a terrible idea. Throwing the borders open, letting anyone come in, will lead to chaos, and we risk being overrun by criminals and terrorists. Let me give you 15 examples of terrorist-related or other violent crime related to illegal immigrants. Now notice again that debater B is not responding to the specific points debater A put forward. Instead, he is arguing against having no control whatsoever. Well, that's not what debater A argued for. Let me give you another example. The BBC license fee. Debater A may say that we should abolish the license fee and finance the BBC through general taxation instead, like they've done in some Scandinavian countries. Debater B then starts talking about how wonderful the BBC is, how good the corporation's journalists are, how important it is now in a time of misinformation and disinformation and social media chaos. They will talk about its honourable history during World War II, etc., etc., all of that stuff. Now, all of that may be true, or of course it may not be true, but even if it is true, the key point is that it's not relevant for the case debater A put forward, which is financing the BBC only differently, not through the license fee, but through some other means. And so therefore debater B is simply arguing against a straw man. He is pretending that what debater A said was that the BBC is terrible and we should get rid of it. But that's not what debater A actually said. Now, so that's what it is. Okay, that's what the straw man is. And that's how it can sneak into our debates, because sometimes we think that the proposition will say something, or the other side will say something, or is saying something, but then they say something slightly different than what we prepared for, or something different than what we imagine, if I might. And if we're not listening carefully enough, and if we're not ready to be flexible and respond to what they're actually saying, then we very quickly, without actually wanting to, end up in straw man fallacy. Okay, so how to spot it when it happens? Now, the straw man fallacy often manifests itself by portraying the other side's argument as more extreme than they really are, or you're sort of making this assumption, often unstated, that those state points are much more extreme. You can often spot a straw man rearing its ugly head by the phrase, "so what you're saying is." This is when you're trying to repeat back what the other side is saying, something that can be helpful for clarification, sometimes if it's done in good faith. But if it's done in the spirit of the straw man fallacy, what follows is a caricature or an exaggerated version of the statement that person just made. Now, whatever you think of Jordan Peterson, and I know he's somewhat controversial and divisive in some quarters, but the fact is that he's had a lot of influence, and he's someone who has some ideas that at least are worth engaging with, I think. But you may disagree. But in any case, whatever you think of him, that's not the point here. The point is that there's an interview which is on YouTube. You can look it up, where Cathy Newman interviews this Canadian psychologist, pop guru, I think it's fair to call him these days. And like I say, you don't need to agree with either of them, but just listen to what Ms. Newman is doing in that interview. When Dr. Peterson comes with a point, she says, "So what you're saying is," and then comes a much more extreme or much more exaggerated version of his views. And then, of course, he then has to clarify, which he does. And so at least he gets more time to clarify what he actually thinks. So that's, I guess, to his advantage. And whereas Cathy Newman ends up looking just a little bit stupid in that interview, quite frankly. And so, and that's the danger with using the straw man fallacy. If the other side calls you out on it and says, "No, that's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm actually saying is." Now, it can also happen, at work, at home, anywhere where you are out there, that people sort of talk past one another. And that's often, it's a form of straw manning very often. You're discussing one thing, but the other person he means something else by perhaps the same terms, the same words. This is one reason why in debates we spend a bit of time, particularly in the first speech, to actually define our terms very carefully, so that we can all agree that this is what we are talking about. And that is to avoid the straw man fallacy and the straw man problem. And so, but when people talk past one another, you are essentially wasting time, right? Because you're not talking about the same thing. So it's a waste of time. Now, in formal debates, what you will notice is that one side is basically arguing against something that the other side didn't actually argue for. So again, you're not engaging. You don't have what we call the clash of ideas. You're just talking about two different things. And that's a waste of a good debate. So don't do that. Now, how to not do that? How to burn the straw man? Get your matches ready. When you are on the receiving end of straw manning, there are various ways to deal with it. So in a formal debate like those we have in our club here at 104 London Debaters, or any other debating society, the first thing to do is to call it out and make sure the audience knows that the other side tried to pull a fast one. Nobody likes being deceived. So this may actually help you to sort of bring the audience over on your side, to make them more inclined towards your side. Explain why the other side's arguments did not address the arguments that you put forward, so that even if the audience agrees with the other side's argument that they just put forward, they should still vote for your side, Why? Because all of those points are completely irrelevant. They were not talking about the actual issue, which is, and then you come back to your case and you explain why. They were just completely trying to talk about something else. This reminds me also of another fallacy called the red herring fallacy, which is where, but that's more obvious. That's where you say, for example, that you talk about the BBC, oh yeah, the BBC, we need to have the BBC because look at what Elon Musk is doing at Twitter. And then you start talking about that instead of talking about the BBC. So it's where you deliberately change the subject and you veer into something completely different in order to sort of get the audience attention away from the real topic. So that's a related fallacy, and sometimes the two happen. Can happen in overlap or happen in the same debate. But I'm focusing now on when we are often putting together an argument. Sometimes we're preparing for an argument and we just assume that the other side is going to say something. But then perhaps they don't say quite what we prepared for, but we carry on with the arguments we prepared, for example. That can happen a lot. And that's just not good enough, okay? If the other side didn't say it, you do not respond to it. It's as simple as that. You have got to be ready to respond to what the other side said. And if you're bringing in, new original points, different points, that's fine, but that must also be relevant to somehow the proposition's case. If you're in opposition, for example, or if you're a rebuttal speaker for the proposition, then it must be in response to something that is relevant to the actual topic of debate and not just something else to try and portray the other side as more extreme or cuckoo than and then it really is. So that's very so this is true for either side. For either side, don't try and portray the other side as crazier than what they are, for example, or more extreme than what they are, because there's a dishonesty in it, first of all, but secondly, as I said, it just wastes a good debate instead of actually clashing and engaging with the ideas you put forward. Now, so in a formal debate, you call it out, you say, that was a complete strawman argument. You can use that just to score some points to show that you know your fallacies. That was a complete strawman fallacy, and so forth, and everything they say is completely irrelevant, etc., etc. Now that helps you because in a debate you're trying to convince the audience and not the other side. However, in work or at work, I should say, or in a domestic or some other setting like that, and more privately with your friends, it's often wise to take a less confrontational approach, at least if you don't want to have your nose punched by someone who gets annoyed with you. Say something like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't clearly explain my view, or I didn't explain it well enough. So, because what you said there that's actually not relevant for what I said. I completely agree with your point, but that wasn't actually what I was what I meant. So let me rephrase. So in other words, what you do is that you, instead of pointing the finger of blame at the other person, which then makes that person go into defend mode and just insist that no, his understanding is right. Instead, what you say is, wow, oh, this is my fault. Sorry, I didn't word my sentences well enough, or I didn't explain well enough what I meant. So let me rephrase that. Then you sort of point the finger at yourself. That makes the other person more receptive, and you can explain your view again, and then hopefully you can then have a meaningful discussion on what the topic is supposed to be about. So in conclusion, avoid the straw man. Avoid him, because the straw man fallacy really makes for boring and uninteresting debates, quite frankly, where the two sides are simply talking past one another. And what's the point of that? Rather than actually engaging with the points put forward by either side. Now, when you notice it in a debate, call it out. Call out the straw man fallacy in a way that's appropriate to the context. Okay, you do it differently privately than you do in a formal debate. And then, importantly, pull the discussion, pull the debate back onto the track that it was supposed to be on. Make sure that you say, look, this is what the motion was. This is what we said. The other side has not engaged with the actual case we put forward. They are trying to pull the wool over your eyes. Now here is the real arguments. This is what it's all about, etc. So there we are. So now, hopefully you're ready to do that. If you like this little podcast, I hope you will click, obviously, the like buttons, but also follow us. Follow this Debating Toastcast so that you will get notifications of any new episode. And I hope to see you in future at a debate meeting at 104 London Debaters.
You've been listening to the Debating Toastcast. Feel free to leave a comment, critical or encouraging. We welcome both. And if you'd like more information about joining the club or coming first as a guest, please have a look at our website, 104londondebaters.club, or send us an email on info@104londondebaters.club. That's info@104londondebaters.club. Thank you for listening.